Who was Madeleine Astor? The gilded beginnings and harrowing survival of the Titanic's most famous widow. The sea was calm the night it shattered her world. April 14th, 1912. The RMS Titanic glided through black water like a floating palace, its decks glittering beneath a frozen moon. In cabin C-62, an 18-year-old woman pressed a hand against her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of the child she carried. Her husband, one of the richest men alive, told her softly, "It's only an iceberg." Minutes later, he was denied a place beside her in the lifeboat. The last words she ever heard him say were, "The sea is calm. You will be all right." She would survive, but nothing in her life would ever be all right again. When Madeleine Talmage Force Astor stepped onto New York's pier 4 days later, the newspapers called her the richest girl who couldn't vote. They had no idea that the fortune meant to protect her would become her cage. This is the story of the widow the Atlantic spared, and the world destroyed. Stay with us, because what happened after the Titanic would be even more tragic than the night it sank. Tonight, we peel back the myths and follow the real Madeleine Astor to discover who she was before the tragedy and what the sea left behind. Palm Beach, 1938. The front pages screamed her name again. Titanic widow divorces boxer. In photographs, her eyes looked hollow, her hands wrapped in bandages. The testimony was brutal. Broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and a husband who treated her fortune like a punching bag. Enzo Fiermonte, the Italian boxer she had married for romance or maybe loneliness, sold his story to the tabloids under a cheap headline, "I married the Titanic widow." It was a confession and a mockery in one, and for Madeleine Astor it was the final humiliation. Reporters who once called her the bravest woman of the Atlantic now snickered at her ruin. The society that had once condemned her for marrying an older man now condemned her for marrying a younger one. Her Fifth Avenue mansion was gone. So was the income from the Astor Trust she had forfeited for love 2 decades earlier. She lived in a small house near the sea, surviving on what remained of her inheritance and a few whispers of pity. In the courtroom, she sat quietly while lawyers listed her injuries, and the crowd leaned forward to see how a once golden woman looked when the gold was gone. When the judge declared the marriage an affront to decency, Madeleine did not speak. She merely nodded, as if she had heard those words before, as if her whole life had been a slow lesson in the public ritual of disapproval. Outside, the press flashed cameras, recording the final fall of a woman who had once been America's most envied bride. A reporter wrote the line that would haunt her memory. Her story began on the front page and ended there. She would leave the courthouse alone that day, the Florida sun hard on her face, the ocean wind carrying salt and shame. No one could see that in the quiet hours of the night. She still dreamed of another sea, the one that had once spared her life but took everything else. The Atlantic had given her a second chance, and America had spent the next 26 years taking it away piece by piece. Before the scandal, before the courtrooms, and the broken bones, she had been simply Madeleine Talmage Force, a Brooklyn girl with polished manners, a clear voice, and eyes that reflected a kind of quiet curiosity about the world. Her father owned a shipping company. Her mother was a Talmage, descended from an old New York family. By all accounts, Madeleine was as bright as she was rich. She attended reputable schools, Miss Ely's and later Miss Spence's school in Manhattan, where she distinguished herself as a brilliant pupil. In due time, she graduated with distinction in the spring of 1910. Her education outside of the classroom, however, was far more interesting. Madeleine's parents were big believers in broadening their children's horizons. As such, their mother took Madeleine and her sister on grand tours through Europe, including one particularly long sojourn in Paris. Suffice to say, She left an impression anywhere she went. Paris left as deep an impression on Madeleine as she did on it. During her adventures in the City of Light, Madeleine caught the attention of journalist Emma Bullitt, who wrote about her with clear admiration. According to Bullitt, the young woman could speak and write French with a grace and fluency far beyond her years. And yet, Madeleine was no haughty aristocrat. She was warm, approachable, and had a genuine love for animals. A girl both intelligent and kind, polished, yet tender. It seemed that all of Paris had fallen under her spell. Though Madeleine's family may not have made it onto Mrs. Cool's, Astor's famous 400 list, they certainly lived like the top 1% of the 1%. Yet fate has a strange sense of irony, because it was that very circle's heir, Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, who would change everything. Every summer, Madeleine retreated to Bar Harbor, Maine, surrounded by sea breezes, breathtaking scenery, and freshly minted millionaires who built their mansions along the coast. It didn't take long before she became the name on everyone's lips. On December 22nd, 1910, Madeleine made her official debut into New York high society, a dazzling entrance everyone was talking about. Fashion writers and social columns hailed her as one of the most beautiful debutantes of the season. A young woman, radiant, refined, and effortlessly captivating. In short, Madeleine was the it girl of her time, the one everyone wanted to know. One man, in particular, couldn't resist her charms. When they met in Bar Harbor during the summer of 1910, Madeleine was 17, playing tennis in the sunlight while the ocean shimmered beyond the courts. He was 47, tall, reserved, his grey hair and immaculate suits giving him the air of a man carved from old wealth itself. He had recently endured a scandalous divorce, the kind that could exile a man from polite society. But he still carried the Astor name, a dynasty that had built New York's hotels, financed its railroads, and defined the very idea of American fortune. For a young woman who had been taught to curtsy before men like him, it must have felt like stepping into a fairy tale written by the newspapers. Their courtship was discreet at first: letters, drives along the coast, polite dinners under the watchful eyes of chaperones. Yet by the time word of their engagement reached the press in August 1911, the reaction was volcanic. Clergymen thundered against them from pulpits. Suffragists and social reformers called it indecent. A middle-aged man of the world wrote one editorial. Marrying a child still learning the alphabet of society, Madeleine fainted under the pressure of constant reporters outside her home. Priests refused to perform the ceremony, claiming it would tarnish the church. Finally, a single congregational minister agreed, for a fee that the press gleefully reported as $2,000. On September 9th, 1911, beneath the gilded ceilings of Beechwood, Astor's Newport mansion, the vows were spoken. The bride wore white satin and a string of pearls so luminous they seemed to hum under the gaslight. The groom's son, Vincent, stood stiffly as best man, silent through the entire ceremony. Outside, the Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt and rumor through the gardens. "She has everything," one guest whispered, "except peace." Even the wedding's triumph felt uneasy, a victory bought at the price of reputation. For a brief time afterward, life unfolded like a dream. Their Fifth Avenue mansion glittered with guests. The St. Regis Hotel, which Astor himself had built, opened its doors to them as if to royalty, and every dinner, every appearance, was front-page news. Yet behind those doors, Madeleine was already learning the discipline of silence. She smiled when newspapers mocked her as the baby bride, smiled when the same society that had once adored Astor refused to visit her drawing room, smiled even when she overheard servants whisper that she had married for money. Perhaps she believed love could redeem it all, that sincerity could melt scandal. By the winter of 1911, the scandal had begun to cool, replaced by the softer glow of curiosity, and when she discovered she was with child, she felt something close to hope. Her husband suggested they spend spring abroad, away from gossip. Europe would be kind, he said. Egypt would be beautiful. They packed trunks of silk gowns and steamer coats, and on a mild April morning in 1912, they boarded the world's most luxurious new ship, the Titanic. Madeleine thought it would be her return to grace. She had no idea it would be her voyage into legend. Mrs. Astor, it appears, left in one of the last boats which got away from the ship. It was her belief that all the women who wished to go had then been taken off. Her impression was that the boat she left in had room for at least 15 more persons. The men, for some reason that she could not and does not now understand, did not seem to be at all anxious to leave the ship. Almost everyone seemed dazed. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a floating kingdom of illusion, 4 city blocks long, trimmed in brass and velvet. It promised that technology had finally conquered nature itself. When Madeleine and Colonel Astor boarded at Cherbourg on April 10, 1912, even the ocean seemed to bow before them. Their suite, C-62 through C-64, was the finest aboard. A private promenade, Louis XV furniture, and a private bath with running water, a luxury unthinkable for most of the world. It cost over $4,000 for the voyage, nearly $50,000 today, an amount that could have bought an entire house in Brooklyn. But for the Astors, it was simply the price of privacy. Madeleine, 5 months pregnant, spent most of the crossing resting in her stateroom, her nurse and maid attending constantly. Her husband was endlessly protective, reading to her from travel journals, checking the weather, visiting the bridge. Passengers stared as they passed. The young wife and her middle-aged husband, the scandalous pair now reduced to curiosity and gossip. Yet to those who watched closely, there was tenderness in the way he guided her arm, or the small laugh she gave when he teased her about her Paris appetite. For once, they looked almost ordinary. The first nights passed with laughter and music. The ship's orchestra played waltzes in the grand dining saloon, while outside the windows stretched a perfect sea, dark and calm as glass. Madeleine wrote in her journal about the soft air and the feeling that the world cannot possibly end while one is so happy. But in the small hours of April 14th, the illusion cracked. At 11:40, a grinding noise jolted her awake. Her husband assured her it was nothing, but his voice carried an edge. He stepped out to ask a steward, returned pale, and said quietly, "We've struck ice." From there, time dissolved. Orders echoed through the corridors. All passengers on deck, and still, few believed they were in danger. Astor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, fetched her life jacket, and led her toward the boat deck, where flares already lit the sky. Steam hissed from ruptured vents. The sound was sharp and ghostly. She noticed one third-class woman clutching a baby and, without hesitation, handed her fur wrap to keep the child warm. That detail, reported later in the New York Times, became proof of her composure, her quiet grace under terror. At 1:55 a.m., Lifeboat 4 hung beside the hull. Astor guided his wife through a promenade window, with her maid and nurse behind her, then turned to Second Officer Lightoller and asked permission to accompany her because she was in a delicate condition. Lightoller refused. "No man may board until the ladies are clear." Astor's face did not change. He leaned close, kissed Madeleine once, and said, "The sea is calm, and you will be all right." Those were his last words. As the boat descended, Madeleine gripped the edge until her fingers ached. The orchestra still played Autumn, the notes drifting like smoke through the night. Above her, she could see her husband standing at the rail, hands clasped behind his back. Then a sound like thunder, the great ship splitting in two, and the night filled with screams. She rowed blindly through debris and freezing water until the horizon began to glow with the first light of dawn. When the Carpathia appeared, she was silent, numb, her hair stiff with ice. The newspapers called her the Titanic widow, but the name would become something else entirely, a prophecy. When she returned to New York 4 days later, crowds waited at the pier. She was no longer the scandalous bride or the naive debutante from Brooklyn. She was a symbol now of courage, tragedy, and something far more dangerous: the illusion that survival meant salvation. By 1916, America had moved on from the Titanic, but Madeleine Astor's name still shimmered like an echo from another age, a name that symbolized both romance and ruin. She was 22, the mother of a 4-year-old boy, still bound by a fortune that required her to live as a statue in mourning. But youth does not wait for the approval of lawyers, and the heart does not understand the language of trusts. That spring, she made the choice that would rewrite her destiny. His name was William Carl Dick, tall, kind-eyed, a banker from an old Philadelphia family, and someone she had known since childhood. He wasn't a tycoon or an aristocrat. He was the kind of man who noticed when her gloves were threadbare, who waited while she composed herself before a camera flash. He asked about her son instead of her fortune, where others saw the shadow of a legend. He saw a young woman who wanted to be seen for herself. At first, she resisted. Love, to her, had always carried a price tag, but William was patient, ordinary, in the most disarming way. He brought her wildflowers instead of diamonds, took her walking by the sea where no one recognized them, and made her laugh, a sound she had almost forgotten belonged to her. That summer, she allowed herself to believe that happiness might be possible without headlines or inheritance. The decision came quietly, almost stubbornly. She would marry him, no matter the cost. Her lawyers reminded her of the clause in Colonel Astor's will. If she married again, she would lose her $5 million trust and the use of both Astor mansions. In today's value, her decision meant walking away from more than $160 million, one of the most expensive vows in American history. If Madeleine's story had unfolded today, the ending would have been different. Modern American law no longer allows a widow to be stripped of everything simply for falling in love again. Under current inheritance law, even if a spouse is written out of the will, the law protects a portion of the estate, usually 1/3 to 1/2, depending on the state. The surviving spouse may elect to take this legal share instead of what's written in the will, and the court will compel the estate to pay it, regardless of the deceased's wishes. Imagine a billionaire who leaves everything to his children. His widow can still file a request. I choose my elective share. And no matter what the will says, the court will restore at least 1/3 of the estate to her, because that is her lawful right, not a gift. As for the no remarriage clauses that once destroyed fortunes like Madeleine's, they would now be deemed an invasion of personal freedom and struck down as invalid. A woman today can remarry, raise her children, and still keep what is rightfully hers. A few states still allow limited conditions. For instance, to protect children from a previous marriage or prevent assets from leaving the family. But modern courts review all such clauses under the principle of reasonableness. A condition must be fair, not punitive, yet power never truly disappears. It merely changes its form. Today, lawyers call it asset protection. Dynastic families hide control inside modern trusts and prenuptial agreements. The language sounds gentler, for your security, for family stability. But the purpose remains the same, to decide how long loyalty should last, and who must pay when it ends. Laws evolve. Control simply learns new words. And somewhere, beneath the pale light of a courtroom, there will always be new Madeleines, standing between love and law, learning that justice and fairness are not always the same thing. In a bright August morning in Bar Harbor, she spoke those vows aloud. The moment she said, "I do," the legal machinery of the Astor estate snapped shut. The trust dissolved. The properties reverted to her stepson, Vincent Astor. She had traded palaces for love and found, too late, that love could be fragile currency. Yet for a while, the gamble seemed worth it. On a clear August morning, she married William Carl Dick in a simple ceremony beneath a white trellis, sunlight glinting off the ring he could barely afford. The newspapers called it romance over riches. But to Madeleine, it was more than that. It was her first act of defiance. For a while, peace seemed real. They built a quiet life on Long Island, far from the marble facades of Manhattan. 2 sons were born, William Force Dick and John Henry Dick, and for 17 years, she lived the ordinary joys she had once envied in others. Breakfast in the garden, birthdays without photographers, summers without gossip. Yet the Great Depression arrived like a slow-moving storm. Banks failed, fortunes shrank, and love began to erode beneath the pressure of unpaid bills and fading comfort. William turned distant. Madeleine turned silent. When they divorced in 1933, the papers hardly cared. The world had found new tragedies. She thought anonymity might finally save her. But destiny, as always, circled back. Later that same year, at a Palm Beach party, thick with cigarette smoke and jazz, she met a man who would burn away what peace she had left. Enzo Fiamonte, a handsome Italian boxer and actor, with a grin like a promise. He was everything William was not. Magnetic, dangerous, and once again, against all reason. The Titanic widow stepped toward the edge. When Madeleine met Enzo Fiamonte, she was 40, fragile, and longing for proof that she could still be desired. He was 26, bronze-skinned, broad-shouldered, with movie star looks and a swagger that filled every room. He called her Bella Signora, kissed her hand like a matador, and spoke of destiny as if love were a championship fight he intended to win. To the Palm Beach crowd, they were spectacle. To Madeleine, he was oxygen. After years of quiet endurance, someone finally looked at her, not with pity, but hunger. Their marriage in 1933 shocked what remained of polite society. The New York Times called it bewildering. The Herald Tribune called it romantic folly. Friends begged her to reconsider, but Madeleine had stopped listening to warnings. She had obeyed society once, and it had left her widowed and alone. Now, she would disobey, even if it killed her. At first, it was all light. Seaside drives, champagne at noon, and laughter that almost sounded like youth. Enzo enjoyed being married to the famous Titanic widow. Reporters followed them, and photographers swarmed when they arrived at parties. But beneath the charm lay something meaner. The spending began. Cars, horses, clothes, jewelry. Madeleine signed the checks without protest, hoping extravagance might keep his affection. When the money thinned, so did his patience. By 1936, the gossip pages had turned cruel. They wrote that the boxer had turned his fists on his wife, that she hid her bruises beneath long sleeves, that her laughter had disappeared again. When she filed for divorce in 1938, the courtroom became a theatre of humiliation. She testified about broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and nights when she locked herself in her room to stay alive. The papers ran the story beside old photos of her stepping off the Carpathia, as if the ocean tragedy and this domestic one were two halves of the same fate. Fairmont, unwilling to fade quietly, sold his side of the story to True Story magazine under the headline, "I Married the Titanic Widow." He earned more from the scandal than she did in alimony. America devoured it. The rise, the fall, the spectacle of a woman punished for every attempt at love. By the time the divorce was final, Madeleine was nearly penniless. The Fifth Avenue mansion had long been sold. The Astor Trust was gone. Even her jewels had been pawned to cover legal costs. She retreated to a small house in Palm Beach, where neighbors sometimes saw her sitting on the porch at dusk, staring toward the ocean, that same ocean that had once spared her life. The world had called her lucky once, but luck, she had learned, was only the name people gave to the tragedies that hadn't happened yet. By the end of the 1,930 seconds, Madeleine Astor had become a ghost of her own legend. The glittering debutante, who had once crossed the Atlantic in gowns embroidered with pearls, now lived quietly in a stucco house by the Florida shore. Her fortune was gone. Her marriages ended. Her name reduced to a melancholy curiosity in gossip columns. The Titanic widow seen again in Palm Beach. Neighbors remembered her as polite but distant, a woman who smiled as if it hurt. She hosted small afternoon bridge games to earn pocket money, sometimes gambling for modest stakes. Once, a guest whispered that the silver tea set on her table still bore the Astor crest, a relic from a life that felt like someone else's dream. At night, she sat near the window, watching the horizon where the sea met the dark, the same sea that had once taken her husband and left her to a lifetime of survival. Her health was failing. Years of anxiety, heartbreak, and public humiliation had left her dependent on sedatives. Friends noticed her hands trembled when she poured tea. Her voice, once lilting and bright, had softened to a whisper, yet, even then, she clung to the image of composure that society had demanded from her since she was 18. When a reporter once tried to ask her about the Titanic, she said only, "I still dream of the cold." On the morning of March 27, 1940, her maid found her unresponsive in bed, the curtains still drawn, a half-empty bottle of sleeping pills on the nightstand. The official cause was heart seizure. The newspapers printed her obituary beside photographs from her youth. The radiant girl in white who had married one of the richest men in the world. Some columnists called it an accidental overdose. Others whispered suicide. Either way, it felt like an ending long delayed. She was 46. Her estate contained less than $90,000. A fragment of the fortune that had once made her one of the richest women in America. The Fifth Avenue mansion she once ruled had already been demolished by her stepson Vincent that same year, replaced by a luxury apartment building. Even the house that bore her name was erased, as if her existence had been a rumor the century wanted to forget. At her funeral, there were no reporters, no high society crowds, only her sons, a few friends, and the dull murmur of the sea beyond the chapel. The same sea that had given her life once, now seemed to claim her memory in silence. Her story, more than a tragedy, became a quiet parable about the curse of inheritance, how wealth, meant to protect, can become a gilded chain, how the pursuit of respectability can suffocate the soul. She survived the Titanic, but not the world that came after, and as the last light fell through the chapel window, it was hard not to wonder. Perhaps the ocean had been kinder than society ever was. Some say the Titanic carried a mummy's curse, that an ancient Egyptian relic, sealed for millennia, was being transported to New York when the ship went down, bringing misfortune to all who touched it. So what doomed Madeleine Astor? A curse? A clause? Or a century that demanded women pay for wanting both love and freedom? Maybe it wasn't the sea that haunted her after all, but the inheritance of a world that still treats survival as a debt to be repaid. That, perhaps, is the real Titanic curse. Not the legend that sank a ship, but the system that sinks people. So now we ask you, if you were Madeleine Astor, what would you have chosen? Would you have guarded the Astor fortune behind iron gates, living in comfort but alone? Or would you have risked it all for the fragile warmth of love, even knowing how quickly it can turn to ash? Every era has its own kind of shipwreck. For Madeleine, it was the Titanic. For us, perhaps, it's the illusion that money can anchor happiness. Her lifeboat may have saved her body, but it could not rescue her from the expectations of a world that valued reputation over peace, control over kindness. History often remembers her as the Titanic widow, young, beautiful, tragic. But maybe it's time we remember her differently, as a woman who kept choosing to live, even when life kept demanding she drown. This is Old Time Docs. Thank you for joining us tonight as we revisited the rise and fall of Madeleine Talmage Force Astor, the gilded bride who survived the Atlantic, but not the century. Tell us in the comments, would you have chosen love over security? Your thoughts, reflections, and debates help keep stories like hers alive. So if you found this episode meaningful, remember to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because sometimes, looking back isn't about nostalgia, it's about recognizing the patterns we still live with today.